Super 6-1 is going down. I say again, Super 6-1 is going down. Black Hawk down. Grid Kilo 78. 90 seconds later, a second Black Hawk fell. 18 Americans would die in the next 15 hours. 73 would be wounded. 200 Somali fighters would die in the streets around them, and the most elite combat force the United States had ever deployed would spend a night trapped in a city it had entered by plan for 45 minutes. This is Mogadishu, October 3rd, 1993, the day that changed how America goes to war. The battle that started as a snatch operation and became a referendum on American will. The story of two men who were told they could not survive and chose to go in anyway. To understand Mogadishu, you have to understand what Somalia was in 1993 and how a country falls completely apart. Somalia had been a functioning state, in the minimal sense of that term, under President Siad Barre since 1969. Barre had ruled through a combination of clan manipulation, Soviet and then American patronage, and direct repression. His secret police, known as the NSS, maintained order through surveillance and violence. His government distributed resources through clan networks that kept key factions loyal. In January 1991, the coalition of clans that had sustained Barre's government finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and the strain of a losing war against Ethiopia. Barre fled Mogadishu. The government dissolved. The army disbanded. The police force stopped functioning. What replaced the government was the pure expression of Somali clan politics, without the overlay of state structures that had, however imperfectly, mediated the competition between clans. The result was civil war. The Civil War disrupted agriculture, trade, and the distribution of food aid. Somalia's agricultural zones, which could produce enough food in good years to sustain the population, stopped producing when farmers fled, or when armed factions seized harvests to sell or to feed their fighters. The humanitarian aid that flowed in from international organizations was systematically seized and sold by faction leaders who used the proceeds to buy weapons and pay their fighters. By 1992, the combination of war and famine was killing Somalis at rates that shocked even experienced humanitarian workers. Conservative estimates placed the death rate from famine-related causes at 300,000 per year. Images of skeletal children appeared on television screens worldwide. The images produced political pressure on the Bush administration in its final weeks. Operation Restore Hope, an American-led multinational intervention to provide security for humanitarian food distribution, deployed in December 1992. The food began to move. The immediate famine crisis abated significantly within months. The Clinton administration inherited the mission. What came next was a significant escalation of the mission's scope, done with insufficient public explanation of the escalation, that would produce the events of October 3rd. The UN's authorization, UNISOM II, passed in March 1993, included not only humanitarian protection but nation-building objectives, creating the conditions for a political settlement, rebuilding Somali governance institutions, establishing a process for the Somali people to govern themselves. This was a fundamentally different mission than feeding people. It required choosing sides in a political conflict. The dominant faction leader in Mogadishu was Mohammed Farah Aidid. He commanded the Somali National Alliance and controlled the Bakra Market District and other key areas of the city. He had concluded that the UN's political project was designed to reduce his power, and he was not wrong. Any legitimate governance structure that the UN helped build would draw authority from popular legitimacy rather than clan control, which was the basis of Aidid's power. He began attacking the UN mission. On June 5, 1993, Aidid's forces ambushed a Pakistani peacekeeping unit that was conducting a scheduled inspection of an SNA radio facility. 24 Pakistani soldiers were killed. It was the largest single-day loss of UN peacekeepers in years. The UN Security Council passed Resolution 837 the same day, authorizing the use of force against those responsible for the attacks and directing that those responsible be detained for prosecution. Task Force Ranger deployed to Somalia in August 1993, specifically to execute that mandate. The force was the most capable direct action unit the United States military had ever deployed. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force for the assault element, elements of the 75th Ranger Regiment for perimeter security and blocking, and the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, for aviation. Delta Force had been in existence since 1977, built by Colonel Charles Beckwith on the model of the British Special Air Service. Its selection and training processes were the most demanding in the American military. Its operators had spent years practicing exactly the kind of mission Task Force Ranger was designed to execute: a rapid helicopter insertion, a target building seized in minutes, detainees loaded on a ground convoy, exfiltration complete before the local security environment could organize a coherent response. The 75th Rangers were different but complementary. Light infantry trained to standards significantly above conventional forces, their role in these operations was the outer ring: establish the perimeter, prevent reinforcement of the target, fight anyone who tried to reach the assault element. Rangers were not Delta. They were not trying to be. They were the best light infantry in the Army, and in that role they were exactly what Task Force Ranger needed. The 161st SOAR had been flying for Special Operations Forces since 1981, created specifically from the lessons of Eagle Claw. Their training standard, 45 feet and 30 seconds, meaning the ability to place a helicopter within 45 feet of any designated point, within 30 seconds of the planned time, in darkness, in weather, in the presence of hostile fire, was what you needed for this kind of operation. Task Force Ranger had been in Mogadishu for 5 weeks before October 3rd. During those 5 weeks, they had executed 6 similar missions, snatch operations targeting senior figures in IDID's network. None had produced the primary target, but all had captured secondary targets, and all had been completed without American fatalities. The pattern had established a working framework. The missions were dangerous, but the force was capable enough to execute them at manageable risk. The mission on October 3rd was driven by intelligence that had a time limit attached. Omar Salad Elmi and Mohammed Hassan Awale, 2 of IDID's most senior political advisors, were reported at a meeting in the Olympic Hotel neighborhood of the Bakara Market. The Bakara Market was the most hostile area in Mogadishu. It was IDID's stronghold, the district where his clan had the deepest roots, the most complete warning network, and the most fighters per square block of any area in the city. The meeting was happening now. The intelligence was perishable. If they waited for darkness, the targets would be gone. The mission launched at 15:32. The tactical plan was the template the task force had used 6 times. Little Bird helicopters to insert Delta operators onto the objective building's roof and into the courtyard. Black Hawks carrying Rangers to insert them onto the surrounding streets for the outer perimeter. A ground convoy of Humvees and supply trucks to load the detainees and drive them out. Estimated time on target, 45 minutes. Everything went wrong in the first 30 minutes before the Delta element had even finished clearing the objective. Private First Class Todd Blackburn was on his first combat mission. He was 19 years old when his Ranger chalk fast-roped from their Black Hawk. The rotor wash from 4 helicopters converging on the objective created turbulence that moved the rope. Blackburn lost his grip at approximately 60 feet. He hit the street and survived, but sustained severe injuries, broken legs, and spinal trauma. He became the first casualty of the mission before a single shot had been fired in the objective building. Delta's work inside the building was fast and professional. The breach was clean. The rooms were cleared. Salad and a whale were flex-cuffed within minutes of entry. 24 additional detainees were secured. The objective was accomplished inside the building on the planned timeline. Outside the building, the environment was deteriorating. IDID's militia had a warning network that had been specifically designed to respond to exactly this kind of operation. Runners with walkie-talkies were positioned throughout the Bakara Market and the surrounding neighborhoods. When American helicopters were observed, the runners activated. Word moved block by block through the network. Armed fighters began moving toward the sound of helicopter engines. By the time the ground convoy entered the Bakara market, hundreds of Somali fighters were already converging on the objective area. The streets were filling. At 16:20 hours, Chief Warrant Officer Cliff Wolcott was piloting Super 6-1 in a banking orbit above the objective when an RPG-7 round found the tail rotor assembly. The RPG-7 is a Soviet-era anti-armor weapon that has not fundamentally changed since its introduction in 1961. It fires a rocket-propelled grenade from a shoulder-mounted tube. Its basic warhead is designed for armored vehicles, but its effectiveness against the vulnerable tail rotor assembly of a helicopter had been demonstrated in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, against the Soviets, and now in Somalia. At the right angle, at the right range, a single RPG round could destroy a helicopter. Wolcott kept control long enough to direct his crash into the most open available space. He was 30 feet above the street when the aircraft struck a building. The main rotor carved a channel in the road. The fuselage bounced and came to rest at an angle. Wolcott and his co-pilot were dead from the impact forces. 4 crew members survived. The crash location was known throughout the Bakra market within minutes. Thousands of people had seen it. Armed fighters were moving toward the crash site from every direction. In an orbiting Black Hawk above the city, Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart were watching everything through their optics. Gordon and Shughart were Delta snipers aboard an MH-60L direct-action penetrator, a gunship variant of the Black Hawk fitted with miniguns and rocket pods. They had been orbiting, providing overwatch for the ground element, watching the situation develop in real time. They could see the crash site. They could see the crew members alive in the wreckage. They could see the militia converging. They could see that no ground force was close enough to reach the crash site before the militia did. Gordon requested permission to insert at the crash site, to fast rope in and protect the survivors until a ground convoy could reach them. The tactical assessment from the command element was clear. Inserting 2 men without ground support into a crash site surrounded by converging militia was a death sentence. The ground convoy was unable to navigate to the crash site through the burning tires and armed crowds and wrong turns that had already slowed it to a crawl. There was no ground support to give. Permission denied. Gordon requested again. Permission denied? He requested a 3rd time. The officer reviewing the request looked at the drone feed showing the crash site, looked at the 2 men asking to go in, and approved the insertion. Gordon and Shughart were lowered to the crash site by a hovering helicopter. For approximately 40 minutes, the 2 Delta snipers held the crash site against a force that grew as fighters arrived from the surrounding streets. They moved constantly around the wreckage, using the helicopter fuselage and concrete walls as cover. They moved 1 wounded crew member to better cover. They engaged fighters at ranges from 200 meters down to arm's length. When Gordon's ammunition was exhausted, he gave his remaining rounds and his personal weapon to the sole surviving crew member, Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant. Gordon was killed. Shughart continued to fight. When Shughart's ammunition was exhausted, he gave his remaining rounds to Durant. Shughart was killed. Durant was beaten by the crowd, captured, and appeared on Somali television the following day. He was released 14 days later. Gordon and Shughart were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. They were the first Delta Force operators ever to receive the decoration. At Crash Site 1, Wolcott's Black Hawk, the situation was different. Multiple Rangers and Delta operators had inserted around the crash site and established a defensive perimeter. They were taking casualties continuously, but holding. A second Black Hawk Super 6-4 was shot down attempting to maintain suppressive fire over the expanding battle area. All crew survived this crash. The ground convoy, repeatedly ambushed, taking casualties, navigating streets it had no detailed maps for in a city where burning tires and armed crowds had transformed every intersection into a potential kill zone, could not reach either crash site. It eventually returned to base. A relief force was being assembled. Pakistani M48 tanks and Malaysian armored personnel carriers from the UN force, plus additional American vehicles. It took hours to organize, hours to mount, and hours to fight its way through the same streets that had stopped the original convoy. The relief force reached Crash Site 1 at 01:55 hours on October 4th, 15 hours after the mission had launched. The count, when it was over, 18 Americans dead, 73 wounded, approximately 200 Somali militia dead, many more wounded, 2 Black Hawks destroyed, 1 damaged. The primary targets, Salad and a whale, were in American custody. The footage that reached American television screens was specific and had been filmed by Somali civilians, a dead American soldier, stripped and mutilated, being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu by a cheering crowd. President Clinton saw it at 2300 on October 3rd. Within 48 hours, he had suspended offensive operations against AIDID. Within 6 months, American forces had withdrawn from Somalia. AIDID was not captured. He died in 1996 from wounds sustained in a separate factional conflict. The strategic consequence of Mogadishu was not in Somalia. It was in the analysis conducted by organizations that were watching American behavior carefully and drawing conclusions about American will. In the mid-1990s, Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leadership were developing their theory of how to fight the United States. The theory centered on a simple question: what is the threshold of American casualties in non-existential conflicts at which American public and political will breaks? Mogadishu provided a data point. Bin Laden cited it explicitly in multiple public statements. He argued that the withdrawal from Somalia demonstrated American fragility, that a single dramatic loss, displayed on television, was sufficient to reverse American foreign policy, regardless of the military situation on the ground. He called the United States a paper tiger. That analysis drove the planning for the 1998 embassy bombings, the 2000 attack on the USS Cole, and the September 11th attacks. Whether the analysis was correct, whether American withdrawal from Somalia represented strategic fragility or rational prioritization, is a question military historians continue to argue. The argument is not simple. The mission in Somalia had expanded beyond its original mandate without commensurate political support. The expansion had not been clearly explained to the American public. The public had not consented to the risks of the expanded mission. When those risks materialized, the political support was not there to sustain them. This is the strategic lesson of Mogadishu that transcends the tactical details. Military operations succeed or fail within political frameworks. The political framework that authorizes a mission must be broad enough and durable enough to sustain the cost of the mission if it goes wrong. If the political framework is narrow, if the public's understanding of the mission is limited, if their tolerance for casualties is calibrated to a different mission than the one actually being conducted, then tactical success and strategic failure can exist simultaneously. Task Force Ranger was tactically successful on October 3rd. It achieved its objective. It captured the targets. It fought with extraordinary skill and courage under conditions that rapidly exceeded the plan. The mission was strategically catastrophic because the political framework did not support the cost. Gordon and Shughart understood none of this when they requested permission to insert at Crash Site 2. What they understood was that there were Americans alive in that wreckage and that nobody else was close enough to protect them. They went in. That is the specific human fact at the center of the Battle of Mogadishu. 18 dead, 73 wounded. 2 men who chose to go into a crash site knowing they could not survive, so that 1 man might. Michael Durant came home. Here is what happened at Crash Site 1 through the 15 hours of the battle, told in the detail the tactical picture requires. The perimeter around Crash Site 1, Wolcott's Super 6-1, was established by approximately 40 Rangers and Delta operators who had inserted from their helicopters in the minutes after the crash. The perimeter was small, approximately 1 city block in diameter, because that was the ground that could be held with the forces available. Inside the perimeter, the crash site itself, with the wreckage of the helicopter and the 2 dead pilots and 4 wounded crew members. The medical personnel treating the wounded. the communications element trying to maintain contact with the command element and the aviation above, the ammunition resupply that was running lower with every engagement. Outside the perimeter, Mogadishu. The Bakara market at 1700 hours on October 3rd was full of armed men converging on the sound of the battle. They came from every direction. They came in ones and twos from behind walls and around corners. They came in groups of 10 and 20 from the main streets. They fired RPGs from rooftops, fired machine guns from vehicles, fired rifles from any position that offered a sight line into the American perimeter. The Little Bird helicopter gunships, MH-6 Little Birds fitted with miniguns, operating from the 161st SOAR, flew continuous gun runs over and around the perimeter, suppressing militia positions that threatened to overrun the American forces. The pilots flew at rooftop level, below the altitude that made their aircraft useful targets for RPG fire, threading between buildings in a city they had rehearsed but not mastered. They were hit repeatedly by small arms fire. They kept flying. The Black Hawk helicopters that remained operational after the loss of Super 6-1 and Super 6-4 maintained coverage of the battle area, inserted resupply where possible, and extracted the most severely wounded. Sergeant First Class Randy Shughart's final radio transmission, made after he had given his weapon to Durant and before he was killed, was a request for immediate close air support at his position. The air support was there. It was not sufficient. 300 meters away, at Crash Site 2, Michael Durant was alone with a weapon that had a few rounds remaining and hundreds of militia converging on his position. He fired until he had nothing left. He was captured within minutes of running out of ammunition. He was beaten before his captors realized he was more valuable alive. Durant was a chief warrant officer with years of service in the 161st SOAR. He was taken to a house in Mogadishu and held for 14 days. During captivity, he was filmed for Somali television. The footage was broadcast internationally and was seen in the United States as part of the coverage of the battle. He was released on October 14, 1993, through negotiations brokered by Nigerian UN General Festus Mogae. The negotiation for Durant's release was handled quietly and quickly, partly because the alternative was unclear, and partly because the administration needed the crisis to be over. The relief convoy that finally reached Crash Site 1 at 01:55 hours on October 4th was a coalition force. Pakistani M48A5 main battle tanks, Malaysian Condor armored personnel carriers, and American vehicles, about 100 vehicles total. The convoy had been assembled from the multinational force based at the Pakistani stadium and fought its way through the same streets that had stopped the original Task Force Ranger convoy hours before. The difference was the Pakistani tanks. The M48 tank is a 1950s American design. It is large and slow by current standards, but in the streets of Mogadishu, it was decisive. Militia fighters whose RPG-7s could kill an unarmored Humvee could not kill a tank with the same weapon at point-blank range. The tanks moved through the militia positions that had stopped the original convoy, creating a path for the rest of the relief force to follow. The relief column reached Crash Site 1 and extracted the survivors and the dead. Wolcott and his co-pilot were removed from the wreckage. Every American was accounted for. In the days that followed, the administration moved quickly to limit the political damage. Clinton met with the Joint Chiefs and authorized a temporary reinforcement of forces in Somalia, additional armor, additional troops, while simultaneously announcing that American forces would withdraw within 6 months. The reinforcement was intended to show that America would not be seen as running, while simultaneously managing the political reality that America was, in fact, leaving. The withdrawal was completed in March 1994. Aidid continued to operate in Mogadishu until his death in August 1996 from wounds sustained in fighting with a rival faction. His son Hussein Aidid, who held American citizenship and had served in the United States Marine Corps Reserve, briefly succeeded him as SNA leader. The international humanitarian situation in Somalia continued to deteriorate. the country would not have anything resembling a functional central government for another 15 years. The tactical post-mortem from Mogadishu produced several significant changes to American Special Operations doctrine and practice. The most important was the requirement for adequate armor in any urban environment. The Task Force Ranger Force had been configured as a light force, Humvees, 5-ton trucks, helicopters, on the assumption that speed and surprise would substitute for protection. The assumption worked for 45 minutes. When the mission extended to 15 hours, the absence of armored vehicles that could move through sustained militia fire without being stopped was the critical gap. Subsequently, American Special Operations Forces conducting urban operations have maintained the capability to integrate armor support, either organic or from conventional forces on call. The second change was in mission planning philosophy. The pre-mission analysis of Task Force Rangers operations focused heavily on the success cases, 6 successful missions, 0 American fatalities, and used that track record as evidence that the operation could continue at manageable risk. The track record was real. The conclusion was wrong. The track record told you what had happened when everything went roughly as planned. It did not tell you what would happen when 2 helicopters went down simultaneously, and the ground convoy could not reach either crash site. Military planners call this the red team problem, the tendency to plan for the adversary you expect rather than the adversary who is actually trying to defeat you. Aided's militia had been studying Task Force Ranger for 5 weeks. They had observed the operational pattern. They had prepared the Bakra market for exactly the kind of response they expected. When the mission launched, they were ready. The failure to anticipate that preparation, to wargame the scenario in which the militia was prepared, the helicopters were vulnerable, and the ground convoy was stopped, was a planning failure that subsequent doctrine explicitly required to be addressed through mandatory adversarial planning, designing the worst-case scenario for your own operation, and then determining whether you had the capability to succeed under those conditions. Task Force Ranger did not have the capability to succeed under those conditions. It succeeded anyway, in the sense that the force was not destroyed, and the primary targets were captured. It succeeded at a cost that the political framework could not sustain. The third change was in the relationship between tactical operations and strategic communication. The American public's first knowledge of what happened in Mogadishu was the footage of a dead American being dragged through the streets. They had not been told in any comprehensive way why American forces were in Mogadishu at all, what the expanded mission objectives were, or what level of risk those objectives entailed. The gap between what the public knew about the mission and what the mission actually required produced a political reaction that was essentially unmanageable. No amount of accurate tactical reporting about the force's performance, and the performance was, by any objective measure, extraordinary, could overcome the basic political reality that Americans were dying for a mission that the public had not been asked to support. This is the strategic lesson that the Battle of Mogadishu imprinted on American military planning for the next decade. Military operations require political authorization that is broad enough and durable enough to sustain the cost when things go wrong. The authorization for the Somalia mission was built for a narrower mission than the one that was being conducted. When the cost of the broader mission became visible, the authorization could not sustain it. Every subsequent American military deployment has had to contend with the question that Mogadishu made explicit. Is the political support for this mission sufficient to sustain the losses that the worst-case scenario could produce? For Somalia in October 1993, the answer was no. The men who fought in Mogadishu knew none of this on October 3rd. What they knew was that there were Americans in 2 crash sites and that they were going to stay until everyone was accounted for or they were killed. Every man who held that perimeter through 15 hours understood what it meant. Gordon and Shughart understood it most clearly because they understood it before they went in. 18 dead, 73 wounded, 2 men who chose to die so that 1 man might live. Michael Durant came home. He walked off the plane in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on October 14, 1993. He was emaciated and bruised and had injuries that took months to recover from. He walked off under his own power. Gordon and Shughart made that possible. There is a moment from the battle that does not appear in official records, and that the men who lived it have described in very different terms over the years. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours of October 4th, when the perimeter at Crash Site 1 had been holding for approximately 10 hours, and the relief convoy had not yet arrived, the senior American officer at the crash site gathered his force. He did not give a speech. He did not make promises about relief that was not yet there. He walked the perimeter. He looked at each man. He said a few words to some of them. He checked the ammunition count. He looked at the wounded. He asked the medics what they needed. And then he went back to his position and continued fighting. Leadership under those conditions is not about words. The words available are not adequate to the situation. You cannot tell men something that will make 10 hours of urban combat in the dark in a city full of people trying to kill them feel like anything other than what it is. What you can do is be present, be visible, be the example of continuing to function. That is what the senior officer did. It is what every officer in the perimeter did, at every level, through 15 hours. It is what the sergeants did when the officers were down, what the corporals did when the sergeants were down, what the privates did in the moments when everyone above them was occupied, and the decision had to be made at the lowest level possible. Mogadishu produced a specific kind of leadership assessment that the Army and the Special Operations community have returned to repeatedly in the years since. The assessment is about what leadership looks like when the plan is gone, when the timeline is gone, when the resources are insufficient, and when the question is simply whether to continue or to stop. Every man in that perimeter chose to continue. That is the tactical fact that cannot be trained. You can train the techniques, you can train the procedures, you can train the standards, but you cannot train the decision to continue when stopping would be rational. The decision to continue was made 18 times that night by the 18 men who died making it. It was made 73 more times by the men who were wounded and kept fighting. It was made hundreds of times by the men who were not wounded and could have stopped, but did not. The Battle of Mogadishu lasted 15 hours. The American force that fought it was the best military force the United States had ever put in the field. The political framework that sent it was not equal to what it was being asked to sustain. Both of those things are true. The men who fought deserve to be remembered for what they did, not for what the policy was or was not. 18 dead, 73 wounded. The mission was accomplished. The war was lost. That is the specific accounting of October 3rd, 1993. One final accounting deserves to be made. The Battle of Mogadishu produced in the years after an extraordinary body of testimony from the men who fought it. Officers and sergeants and privates who had been 19 and 20 and 25 years old on October 3rd, 1993, spent the following years finding language for what they had experienced and what it meant. The consensus across the rank structure, across the service components, across the decades, was consistent on one point. The battle itself, the fighting, the holding, the staying when staying was almost impossible, was something they would not undo. Not the policy, not the strategic decision, not the loss, the fighting, the choice to be there for each other. That choice, made under fire in the Bukhara market, was the expression of something that training can build and institutions can support, but that ultimately comes from the specific human beings who are present at the specific moment when the choice has to be made. Gordon and Shughart made it at Crash Site 2, 3,000 miles away, in a presidential library. Jimmy Carter had made a different kind of choice in a different desert 13 years earlier. Both choices were correct. Both cost what they cost. The Battle of Mogadishu produced something that battles rarely produce, a clear accounting of the gap between tactical capability and strategic framework. The force that fought in Mogadishu on October 3rd, 1993, was the best small unit combat force the United States had ever assembled. Delta Force, the Rangers, the Night Stalkers, each was the finest example of its type. Together they were something that had no historical precedent. They were not enough. Not because of anything they did or didn't do on October 3rd. They fought superbly. They executed a complex direct action mission under conditions that rapidly exceeded every planning assumption. They held an untenable perimeter for 15 hours. 2 of them chose to die, defending a crash site they had been specifically told they could not survive reaching. They were not enough because the strategic framework that sent them was built for a different mission than the one they were fighting. The mission as planned, 45 minutes, extract the targets, exfiltrate, was a mission the framework could support. The mission as it occurred, 15 hours, 2 crash sites, a city full of fighters, was a mission the framework had not been built to sustain. When the footage appeared on American television screens, the framework broke. Not because Americans couldn't accept casualties, but because Americans hadn't been asked to accept casualties for this specific mission, in this specific place, for these specific objectives. The consent that democratic governments need to sustain military operations, the informed public agreement that the mission is worth its cost, had not been obtained for what the mission became on October 3rd. That is the specific strategic lesson of Mogadishu. The tactical lesson. Integrate armor with special operations forces in urban environments, wargame the worst case. Don't plan 45-minute missions without a plan for 15-hour missions, was absorbed quickly and thoroughly by the military. The strategic lesson took longer. It is still being absorbed. The requirement to match the political framework of a military operation to its worst-case cost, not its expected cost, but its worst-case cost, has been one of the most difficult requirements in American civil-military relations since 1993. It is difficult because worst-case scenarios are uncomfortable to discuss in public before operations begin, because discussing them provides information to adversaries, because it creates political opposition to operations that might have had public support under more favorable assumptions. It is necessary because the cost of failing to do it is Mogadishu. 18 dead. The mission. The withdrawal. The decade. Gordon and Shughart. Say those names out loud at least once before you close this. If this hit you, subscribe. Every week, a story this specific, this honest, this costly. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking about Durant walking off that plane. I want to hear it. And share this. Because the men who went in for one man deserve more than a footnote. Until next time, you know where to find us.